think we should all breathe a collective sigh of relief. Welcome and hello. You have reached the Lectionary podcast, call-in podcast, and this is a ministry of Pomacea Presbyterian Church, a weekly recording where pastors and lay people gather together each week to consider and reflect on the gospel lectionary reading for this coming Sunday. And this coming Sunday is October 20th. And our typical pattern is one of us serves as facilitator and crafts questions, and we send those to the others in advance for preparation and reflection. And this week I am serving as facilitator, and I will go ahead and tell you we've experienced a hurricane, and the questions that we're bringing to the table this week are the same questions that we brought 3 years ago to a different group of people on this podcast. So, gathering with us today, we gather in this recording to share reflections and to be in dialogue with one another. Today, it's my joy to be joined by Kenny.
I was waiting for John. I am Kenny. I'm a pastor at Pomacea Presbyterian, and I am zooming in from the church.
And I am John Reiter, also a pastor at Pomacea Presbyterian Church, and I'm also at the church. Different office, though, but we're both here.
And I'm Sara Mickelson, and I'm zooming in from my office, my work office in Ybor City, which is a tiny city within Tampa proper. And today we are discussing the gospel lectionary from Mark chapter 10, verses 35 through 45. And it's the reading for this coming Sunday. Please join me in prayer. Since we're handling holy things, it seems appropriate. Thank you, God, for bringing us to this moment, to this place, to this time, to have this conversation. Thank you for watching over us and bringing us through the last week and providing us with a path forward this coming week. Amen. Reading from the New Revised Standard Version, starting with verse 35. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came forward to him and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What is it you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit one at your right and one at your left hand in your glory." But Jesus said to them, you do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink and to be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with? And they said, "We are able." And then Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink, you will drink. And with the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or my left hand is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." And when the 10 heard this, they began to be angry with James and John. So Jesus called them and said, "You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. But whoever wishes to be great among you must be your servant. And whoever wishes to be first among you will be slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many." And that ends the reading of our scripture. I feel like we're tracking this pattern in Mark where Jesus performs a healing of a blind man, and then Peter makes this bold confession about who Christ is, and then within the same minute says, no, Jesus, don't go towards Jerusalem. That's a bad idea. I think you should go this way. And completely tries to hijack or co-opt Jesus's mission. And then the next thing Jesus does is explain this mission. And then the disciples try to go in a different direction and take Jesus with them. And Jesus goes, no. And then we have Jesus re-explaining the mission again. And now we have James and John hijacking or co-opting what they think the mission's going to be. And Mark will finish this wonderful little pattern with another healing of a blind person. So I see this as a seeing, not seeing kind of story.
Mm.
And so my questions come from this. How do you see the approach? And here are the questions being asked of James and John. Kenny, what do you think?
So I was in the office with John earlier, and I was speaking to the lectionary progression of these gospel texts and how it's starting to feel pretty redundant, where the disciples just don't seem to be getting it. And Jesus has to keep throwing the same sort of paradox in their face of the first will be the last, that if you want to, you need to be a servant of all. And I found myself thinking, it's kind of I'm tired of the same progression, but then wondering, well, what is this? Why is the redundancy necessary? Because I think it's just actually happening consistently within the narrative. I think it's happening consistently in the narrative because it's human nature to seek our self-interests. And so as I think about the approach of James and John, I immediately go to their self-interests. And it's clear that they have pulled Jesus aside or approached Jesus when it was just them, because the other disciples are hearing about this. They get angry after the fact. This isn't out of like supreme confidence in front of everybody. This is them, I think, trying to maybe get ahead and trying to get into these positions of prestige at Jesus's left and right. And I can't help but to think about children asking their parent for a sleepover when they're young. And the sort of like, you have to just say yes to what I'm going to ask you. And that's what they're doing with Jesus. They try to like they try to like corner him in, and it feels really childish in that way. Like he's like, okay, I know it's a school night, but we've already planned out this really fun night. Can you just let us do it? And the way they go about this just feels kind of young, and it might just actually speak to a young group of disciples, but also maybe something of a, I don't know, I don't want to say silly, but they'll do anything to try to make this thing happen for their self-interest. I have to give them the benefit of the doubt, thinking that there's probably some degree of like authenticity here, that they truly want to be in prestigious places next to Jesus, that they buy into the ministry and they want to be a part of it in a significant way. But with all the other elements, it's hard to experience that very purely, because it definitely comes with a degree of self-interest, a little childish in the ways that they're going about it, and they do this with the other disciples not knowing, which is less ideal.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think, John?
I think it's hilarious that Kenny uses that example of the children, because I had in my notes a similar type of example. I said, this reminds me of playing card games with my kids, especially when they were really little, like playing Uno. And I was told, like, okay, Dad, we're playing, but you can't use the draw 4 card. And you can't use this card, like they set the rules of what it was going to be, like kind of. So it's kind of like, okay, Jesus, we want to ask you something, but you're going to. So here's what we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you, and it just feels this childish element to it, like Kenny was saying. I think that's spot on. They come across to me kind of when I hear these questions. Going back to your original question, their approach feels pretty ambitious, feels bold on their part, selfish. Do whatever we ask, but also a bit presumptuous, but as Kenny was mentioning, they continue in this pattern of the disciples just not getting it, of not understanding who Jesus is or what his ministry is really all about, and especially of what's to come. I think it's interesting that unlike Peter, who he scolds, he doesn't say no, but says, do you think you're really up to this? And of course they say, we are able, or we can. But I think he points them to the fact that they're still not getting what a life of discipleship will look like. And they're missing the boat on what is to come. They're focused on this final point of glory. And so they're missing the boat of the suffering that Jesus has talked about, the life of service that they're called to, and I would say that we're called to as well. I think they have a little bit of a clue, because they do talk about Jesus in the passage, that we want to sit on your right hand, your left hand in your glory. So they know something good is coming, and they're getting maybe a little bit more of an understanding of God's kingdom. But I think they're still not getting it right. And they understand that the kingdom will be a reversal, and they feel like they've been on the margins and the bottom, so now they're going to be on the top. But I think what they're missing, I think what Jesus points to at the end, is that even those who will be great and be at the top, their greatness is in their serving others. And so the kingdom God's kingdom will not look like a human kingdom. And so I think I'm to quickly answer your question, I'm put off by their questions. I'm put off by their approach. But I also recognize that we do the same type of thing in not seeing, we have our eyes towards the end, and we miss a lot of the stuff along the way in terms of the call to service.
It feels a little bit like, let's make a deal, like a game show kind of a thing, where they go, we want you to give us what we want. And we don't want you to ask too many questions. We want you to give us what we want. And I agree. I think it's them seeing Christ as the Messiah, but failing to grasp what that really means. It's like they acknowledge the truth of this, but they don't understand the impact and the longitudinal effect that this is going to have on the way they see the world and what it will do to their hearts and how they will change. I think they are anticipating that God's kingdom will work like an earthly kingdom, and that there's going to be this moment of a flip, and Jesus is suddenly going to be on the throne of whatever the earthly kingdom looks like. And they want to have good, what's the right word? Influence, prestige, reach, authority. And I think I see them trying to get a jump on everybody else, which, I think I also love Mark Davis's title for this particular essay that he writes for this lectionary. He calls it, I Call Shotgun. And he kind of implies that the two brothers are acting like teenagers, trying to get to that place where they have a good line of sight on what Jesus is going to do, but they also have an opportunity to kind of backseat drive. And Kenny, you gave a great speech about backseat drivers and the ability to relinquish control and efficiency over a person who's agreed to take the steering wheel. So I kind of am playing that over in my head. And I wonder if we do the same thing when we presume to speak for God. And I can't imagine how daunting it is to present the gospel to people from a pulpit and still try not to speak on behalf of God and say, no, God means this, or God is intending this. And I think that that's often an opportunity for grace and forgiveness wherever we go. So that's kind of where my thoughts are about that one. In what ways do you identify with the sons of Zebedee and their "we are able" response? John, I'm coming to you first for this one.
All right. I mean, I think their response is a quick response, like, "Oh, we are able, we can do that," and it's a response of being ready to jump at something, to pursue a goal or pursue this spot next to Jesus, without thinking it all the way through. And I think I'll speak for myself. I think we as human beings do that. I do that. I can think over the course of my life when I have given a quick response or kind of leapt without looking, so to speak. And sometimes it's been a lack of knowledge on my part. Sometimes it's been me overestimating my abilities or thinking highly of myself. Sometimes it's just not knowing what I'm getting into, not thinking it all the way through. I remember a time in college when a buddy of mine, I was in school in Tennessee, and I was dating my wife, not my current wife, but we were dating at the time, and she was down in Florida. And he was like, "Hey, my aunt and uncle live in Florida. You want to drive to Florida this weekend?" And I was like, "Sure, yeah, let's do that. Young, dumb, and in love. Let's go." And so we left Friday after classes and drove all through the night to get down to Florida. We're there for basically 24 hours, then spent, 14 hours driving back to Tennessee. And so now I look back on that, and that was an exhausting weekend. And that was, there's a wisdom that comes with age. It's like, that was stupid. Like I can think of plenty of other, way stupider things than that. But it was a thing where I didn't really think it through. It was just like, oh yeah, let's do it. Jump. Right. And so I think for these disciples, it's a combination of their own kind of ignorance and their self-assuredness, and just not getting it. And it's their understanding of what glory is going to look like, their ideas about what Jesus will look like. But they are, like, as we've said before, they're not quite getting the whole picture. And so they don't recognize the challenges of the journey. They don't recognize what's to come, what that is to look like. They just are focused on the end, the glory part. So it comes across a little immature and selfish, but I think we still do that. I still do that. So again, it's that whole being mindful of what don't I know. Maybe it's I do know what it is, but I don't want to live it. And so I think that's where the discipleship part comes into. It's like maybe I don't get it, but sometimes I think we do get it, and it's the hard work of service. It's the hard work of loving that we're called to do. And so I think it's important for us to kind of shift and be thinking about what Jesus ends with, and that we need to tune our hearts and minds to God's reality of what it means to be a disciple, of what it means to serve other people, what it means to truly trust and have faith in following Christ. So that's my thoughts.
Wow, this past week has been really for me an opportunity to see gaps in my preparation for hurricanes. And I would say also it reveals to me where my gaps might be and how I presume other people will be prepared. I will say it's always a surprise when people who grow up in the same house that you do don't understand or don't have the same comprehension of what needs to be done in order to prepare for the unexpected, amazingly ferocious weather that a hurricane is. And so I want to park that thought and go, there's always room for improvement. However, I can easily identify with these brothers as they pronounce their ability to be prepared or able to field what is being asked of Jesus. I'm cautioned, or I should say I'm accustomed to a certain level of humility and recognizing that this is an opportunity for me to see that I am not Jesus or I am not God. But I often try to backseat drive for Jesus or backseat drive for God in situations around me. I read a couple of interesting thoughts about what the baptism of Jesus was like. I think Caroline Lewis's notes on this were really interesting. That there's a passion that comes with that baptism, and that passion is a glorification. And so I kind of want to encourage people to think about that. That might be another question to ask if you were teaching a Sunday school class this week on this lectionary passage. What do you imagine that baptism of Christ to be? And then I find myself continually suspended between my personal confidence and my acute awareness that I am not God. And I often find myself vacillating between self-reliance and following or trusting that I am teachable or I'm working toward teachability. And I find that I'm quite often in need of forgiveness because I've assumed more than I should. And I just kind of want to park that here. I wonder, as these two brothers walk the path without Jesus, do they also find themselves in that boat? What do you got, Kenny?
Yeah, I think James and John depict kind of the gung-ho nature of the young. And there is certainly an element of being naive. But I also look at young people who are often naive, but actually do it and do the work of it. I think of the Acts Church, and it's a bunch of young disciples trying to figure out how to be the community that Jesus has just left. And they do it, and they do it despite their naive place. And so I hear James and John wanting to do it, and maybe not for the right reasons, but confident in their ability to do that, saying we are able, and then kind of wondering maybe they are, maybe they actually are able, and we might be quicker to say they don't know what they're doing. And I think about being a young youth minister, and I knew so little. I knew so little theology. I knew so little about how church works, but I was supremely faithful. And I might have been more faithful then than I am now, though I know a lot more now. And I feel I am certainly more educated, and I understand the dynamics of church and ministry. And so I have to hold that intention of what is lost and gained, even in the where we're naive versus veteran. And so it's a tension for me. And I don't know James and John how they come to Jesus, where they're at in their sort of journey, but I want to give them some space. And what it reminds me of is when in our tradition in the Presbyterian Church, when we're doing communal vows, typically, especially if we're like ordaining elders, one of the ways in which we respond is I will or I do with God's help. And I kind of look at this, we are able, and I think we are able, but it has to have the with God's help element to it. And I think we see that reflected in the Acts church, and they're able because the Spirit is descended upon them, and it comes after, through Pentecost, and they actually take on what they need to do, and they are able, but it's only because the presence of the Spirit of God is with them. And so kind of several thoughts circulating as it relates to their saying we are able.
I agree with you. My third question speaks to the idea that the gospel writer offers us this story as a continuation of a larger conversation about hierarchy and privilege and recognition and prominence and power. In what modern ways do we as Christ followers and as the church still grapple with these challenges today? I'm going to say this is a hard thing for me. I find I'm still entangled and distracted by matters of authority, fame, and wealth. Fear continues to herd me toward self-reliance instead of trust. And I want to command more than is my portion too often. And I find myself reluctant to be teachable. So I would say pride and fear and control probably are the things that drive me away from being a follower as well as I could be. And I'm a terrible backseat driver. I think my husband will testify to that. But I also think, in my defense, I think my way is the better way. And I think that often is what gets me into sticky wickets as I try to be a good co-parent with him and a relaxed driver. Normally, if I'm driving in the car and I'm not asleep, or if I'm sleeping, that's his best opportunity to drive the way he wants to. So, what are your thoughts about this, Kenny?
I have thoughts on this. I do. It's something I've actually given a lot of thought to. Things like hierarchy and privilege and prominence are often snags. They hitch us up in our faith, and we operate so frequently and easily on the kind of eyes on the prize. What can I get out of this? Self-interest really takes center stage often in every endeavor. It seems the church is not excluded there. We're seeing that in the disciples of Jesus. We still see that in the disciples of Jesus today. I feel like as a Christ follower, as an independent person, I could be bold. If it wasn't if I was sort of my ambitions and my security was removed, I could be really bold in some of my convictions, more vocal, less liked, certainly. And as a pastor, I feel like I have to be more tempered, and I have to consider these things in a different way. And I often think about the ministry of Jesus and the teachings of the Gospels and think, oh, they're so offensive so often. Like the way Jesus taught, I imagine the crowds, people left, like people walked away from his teaching because they were offensive. They were so countercultural. It was such a different way of life that to authentically teach or preach how Jesus did, which I'm wanting to do as a preacher, while not disenfranchising an entire group of people or the congregation or being so convicting that we just despair. It's a hard thing to hit as a pastor. And I've had conversations with folks thinking, gosh, I'd be such a probably better pastor if no one was paying me to do it. because of what it touches upon in terms of need, my own security, my family's security, and what we all have to walk some company lines. Like that's the parameters that actually make it hard to do this so much more transparently, fully, to the fullest extent, maybe, that I feel empowered to be as an individual Christ following person. And so I think that touches upon authenticity and who we can actually be at any time when we have to consider things like our reputation, things like our security, hierarchies and the respective hierarchies. It just gets muddled. And so I feel the tension. It's interesting. Before preparing for this podcast, I would have read this passage and felt like, oh, I don't feel great tension. And now with these questions, I'm like, I feel great tension as it relates to these things that we uncover in this passage. And that's appropriate. We should feel tension about these things.
Thank you, Kenny. John, you get last word. What do you think?
I have kind of two thoughts that have been circulating on related to this passage and this question. And the first one deals with kind of ambition. And there's a number of commentaries that talk about how this, how the ambition of these two disciples and Jesus' response and what that means for us. One theme that that came in those commentaries is that ambition is not bad. In fact, if we are not ambitious as a church, if we are settling for the status quo and mediocrity, then that's actually worse than, having some level of ambition. And so I was kind of drawn to that, and that, Jesus doesn't scold them or tell them no, but he's pointing out, I think, that how our priorities need to be aligned in our ambition. So our ambition should be to serve others. Our ambition should be not related to anything of our own glory, but how can we glorify God? That should be our ambition. So I think Jesus is lifting up the importance of serving others and not elevating ourselves over others. And so I was kind of drawn towards that and moving away from a selfish mindset and one that's more about how do we respond to others. And I think, following Hurricane Helene and now Milton, we're seeing a tremendous outpouring of folks who are caring for others, of neighbors helping neighbors. And I think that a lot of what we see going on in our community is what Jesus is calling us to do, is to give of oneself, to look for the needs of others, to care for other people. And so I think, we have right now, in the midst of this trauma, in the midst of this chaos, we've got a lot of really easy, tangible examples to look at and say, this is what we're called to do as disciples. The other part for me, that I'm drawn to is the role of the church, and it's the words I was looking here: recognition, prominence, and power, and how that is part of the church. And so I think that the church oftentimes still tries to be like the structures and be like the hierarchies of power that we see in the world around us. And we think that the church should look like a lot of these entities, and we think that this church should have influence and prominence and even power. Oftentimes we talk about, remember the influence that the church had in the 50s. Well, I wasn't around then, but it sounds really good. It sounds like the church held a seat of power in society and stuff. And so we dream, or we reminisce of those days. And for, I think, those of us who are vocationally involved in the church or who love the church are frustrated when we hear that the church doesn't have those roles today. And we long for a time, I think, of greater shared values across society. And that, but I think it's only appropriate if those values are rooted in what Christ is saying, that we should serve others. I am guilty of this and saying, like, what about the church? When I think about, like, all the volleyball tournaments or sports tournaments that happen even on Easter Sunday, and it's kind of like, well, don't they know that's Easter Sunday? A very personal example, my daughter's high school graduation. She's a senior this year. It's been set. It is a Sunday morning at 10:30 in the morning. So both my wife, who are clergy, we will miss Sunday morning because we will be at our daughter's graduation. But it just speaks to, we're like, what, the church should have its place and so I think we get caught up in thinking that we deserve that prominence. But there's a lot of nonprofits, there's a lot of individuals who are doing good in the world too. And what makes the church different? And so I think I end up here. My immediate response to that news was I pushed back, but then I say, well, what would Jesus be responsive? If Jesus' instruction is here, is something we should be paying attention to. We're called to serve. It's not to have influence in local politics. It's not to have even sway over the school district calendar and when they have graduation. It's not to have influence even in the sporting event and when things are scheduled. It's that we are called to glorify God in serving others. And so I shouldn't get fired up about that. I should be looking more internally and saying like, okay, well, if we're following Christ's teaching here, we should be out serving others. We shouldn't be concerned about when that graduation is scheduled, even though it's an inconvenience and a bummer. But
Wow. Good point, Tim.
I think I'm convicted in it myself, but I'm just drawn to this idea. Okay, this is not what we're about. We're not about power, prominence, and influence. We should be about service and loving our neighbors. And so, and I think we're seeing that right now in response to hurricane stuff. So, good question, Sarah. It's okay they're repeats because they're good ones, still relevant, very much appropriate for us to dive into today.
Well, I want to thank both you and Kenny. During this past week, when we've all tried to find equilibrium after Hurricane Milton and Hurricane Helene, you guys, as the staff of PCPC, have really been a good, steady hand to reach for. And so I want to say that out loud and just thank you. I know I, plus so many others, are grateful for your kindness and your leadership in this opportunity of growth that we are currently facing. Listeners, I hope that these questions and responses may spur you in a desire to dive deeper into what God might be saying to you in this text. If you have any questions or you would like to share your thoughts with us, we would love to hear from you. You can reach us at this email address. It's lectionarycallin@palmacia.org. We also invite you to visit the website at palmacia.org, where you can learn more about the mission and ministry of Palmacia. And if you're looking for a way to help our community in response to Hurricane Helene or Hurricane Milton, there are a variety of opportunities at that website you can look at and determine if they fit what you are trying to do. I'd also like to call your attention to our sister podcast, The First Look at the Lectionary, which is usually recorded on Monday. I'm not sure which day of the week it was recorded on this week. But it offers a quick and first impression of the lectionary text for this coming Sunday. And thanks again so much for joining us. And I hope the weather is beautiful where you all are. And it is a cloudy day here, and we are looking at the first of what I would call faux fall, which means promising weather that's below 80 degrees and looks lovely on paper, but it's probably short-lived. So have a great week, and we'll talk to you again soon.